October 25th, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The mud-caked ground crew watched Captain Joe Foss climb into his battered Grumman F-4F Wildcat for the second time that day. The morning mission had been brutal. Foss had already sent 2 Zeros spinning into the jungle canopy. Now, barely 3 hours later, radar screens showed another massive formation inbound, 16 Japanese bombers with 25 fighter escorts. The odds were impossible. What happened in the next 90 minutes would be studied at every fighter school for the next 8 decades. Foss's Wildcat roared down the pockmarked runway, the Pratt & Whitney R1830 engine screaming at full power. At 12,000 feet, he spotted them, a swarm of Mitsubishi Zeros in perfect formation, their rising sun insignias glinting in the tropical sun. His wingmen looked to him for the signal. Then he did what no one expected. Instead of the standard diving attack from above, or the cautious stern approach the training manuals prescribed, Foss banked hard and pointed his Wildcat's nose directly at the lead Zero. Head on. Closing speed, 600 miles per hour. Time to collision, 8 seconds. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns in his wings erupted. Tracers carved through the air between them. The Zero pilot, realizing too late what was happening, jerked his stick right. Too slow. Foss's rounds tore into the fighter's unarmored nose, shredding the engine and cockpit. The Zero disintegrated in a fireball so close that burning debris rattled off Foss's canopy. By sunset, he would have 5 kills in one day, using the same suicidal tactic every time. What his critics didn't understand would reshape fighter combat doctrine for the entire Pacific War. For 9 weeks, the situation on Guadalcanal had been deteriorating. Since the first American landings on August 7, 1942, the Cactus Air Force, the ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and New Zealand pilots defending Henderson Field, had been locked in a desperate struggle for survival. Every morning brought the same question. Would there be enough flyable aircraft to meet the next Japanese attack? The numbers told a grim story. American pilots were outnumbered 3-1 on good days, 5-1 when major Japanese strikes came down the slot from Rabaul. The 19 original Wildcats that had landed at Henderson in August had dwindled to single digits by October. Pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 combat missions daily. Malaria ravaged the squadrons as viciously as enemy bullets. But the real problem wasn't numbers. It was the aircraft themselves. The Grumman F-4F-4 Wildcat was a brutally honest machine. It had a top speed of 318 miles per hour. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero could hit 331. The Wildcat climbed at 1,300 feet per minute. The Zero managed 3,050. In a turning fight, the nimble Zero could complete 2 full circles while the stocky Grumman lumbered through one. Pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros using pre-war tactics died quickly. The casualty reports from the Solomon Islands documented the slaughter. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 223 had arrived with 19 pilots in August. By October, only 7 remained. Major John Lucian Smith, who commanded VMF 223, described the tactical dilemma bluntly. The Zero can turn inside anything we've got. If you try to follow one through a turn, you'll black out from G-forces before he does, and he'll roll onto your tail and kill you. The standard doctrine, perfected in peacetime training over California and Florida, called for stern approaches, careful deflection shooting, and maintaining altitude advantage. Clean, by-the-book tactics. Against Zeros, they were a death sentence. Veteran pilots developed new approaches. They used the Wildcat's superior diving speed and rugged construction to their advantage. Hit-and-run attacks, boom and zoom. The Thatch Weave, invented by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, allowed pairs of fighters to cover each other through coordinated turns. But there was one tactic that remained absolutely forbidden in every fighter manual: the head-on pass. The logic seemed irrefutable. Two aircraft closing head-on at 600 miles per hour gave each pilot less than 3 seconds to aim, fire, and break away. Miss, and you'd either collide or give the enemy a perfect tail shot as you passed. The math was simple. In a head-on engagement, the odds of dying were roughly equal to the odds of scoring a kill. Avoid frontal attacks unless absolutely necessary, read the official U.S. Navy Fighter Doctrine Manual. Japanese pilots received similar instruction. Neither side's aircraft were designed for head-on combat. Then Captain Joe Foss arrived at Henderson Field on October 9, 1942. At 27 years old, Foss was already considered an old man by fighter pilot standards. Most Marine aviators were fresh-faced 22-year-olds straight from flight school. Foss had spent 18 months as a flight instructor at Pensacola, logging 1,400 hours before he ever saw combat. He'd been told repeatedly he was too old for fighters. He'd also spent every off-duty hour at North Island mastering one particular skill: deflection shooting at high closure rates. When Foss described his preferred tactic to fellow pilots at Henderson, charging directly at enemy formations, firing from the front quarter, the reaction ranged from skepticism to outright alarm. Squadron mates called it reckless. Cowboy flying. Some whispered it was a death wish. 4 days after his arrival, on October 13th, Foss scored his first kill, a 0, shot from the front quarter as it overshot his Wildcat. The critics fell silent when by October 23rd, just 10 days after his first combat mission, Joe Foss had 14 confirmed kills, all using head-on attacks. The Japanese pilots stationed at Rabaul had no reason to fear American fighters in October 1942. For 3 months, their victory reports told the same story. American pilots flew predictable patterns, attacked from behind, and broke off when pressed. The Zero's superior maneuverability gave them the advantage in every traditional engagement. Intelligence assessments from Rabaul, Commander Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara's staff, documented American tactical rigidity and reluctance to engage in close combat. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with 56 kills, described American fighter tactics as textbook but timid. After shooting down 2 Wildcats over Guadalcanal, he reported that American pilots follow their training too closely. They dive away when they should fight. They avoid head-on passes even when they have positional advantage. The Japanese had identified a crucial weakness. American doctrine prioritized survival over aggression. Pilots were trained to live to fight another day, to preserve irreplaceable aircraft and personnel. Against the more experienced Japanese aviators, this conservative approach meant constant retreat. At Henderson Field, the frustration was palpable. Despite the dedication and courage of the Cactus Air Force, Japanese bombers continued to hammer the airfield nearly every day. The Wildcats could score kills during stern chases and diving attacks, but they couldn't prevent the raids. The defenders needed interception capability, the ability to break up incoming formations before they reached their targets. Head-on attacks offered that capability. But they violated every principle of fighter doctrine. Marine Corps leadership at Henderson wrestled with the tactical dilemma. Major Leonard K. Duke Davis, commanding officer of VMF 121, had watched too many young pilots die trying orthodox approaches. He needed results, but he also needed to preserve his squadron. When Foss proposed making head-on passes the squadron's primary tactic, Davis initially balked. "You're going to get yourself killed," he told Foss bluntly. The mathematics were brutal. In a head-on engagement, even a veteran pilot had a 40% chance of collision or taking fatal fire. For inexperienced aviators, the odds were worse. But Foss had done the calculations differently. He'd studied the Zero's construction in intelligence briefings. Unlike the Wildcat, which had armor plating protecting the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Zero sacrificed protection for performance. Its engine had no armor. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. Its lightweight construction meant even a few hits could cripple it. They can't take punishment, Foss argued. The Wildcat can. If we close head-on, they'll break first. They have to. It was a theory, untested in combat, based on technical specifications rather than experience. Davis reluctantly gave Foss permission to demonstrate the tactic on himself, without putting the younger pilots at risk. Then came October 13th, 1942, the day Joe Foss shot down his first Zero with a head-on attack and proved that sometimes the most dangerous move is refusing to back down. What neither side realized was that this shift in tactics would fundamentally alter the aerial campaign over the Solomons. Within 42 days, the results would be undeniable. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about Pacific Theater fighter tactics. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about Joe Foss and his head-on attack doctrine before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. October 25th, 1942, 09:45 hours. The air raid siren at Henderson Field began its wailing alert. Coast watchers 150 miles up the slot had radioed the warning: massive inbound formation, 27 Japanese aircraft, 16 Mitsubishi, G4M Betty bombers escorted by 11 Zeros. Estimated arrival, 45 minutes. Captain Joe Foss stubbed out his cigar and jogged toward his Wildcat. 14 days of combat had taught him to move fast. The ground crew had already warmed up the engine. He strapped in, adjusted his parachute harness, and signaled thumbs up. The R-1830 engine thundered to life. 8 Wildcats from VMF 121 and 6 from VMF 122 roared down Henderson's dusty runway. Foss led his division, 4 aircraft in a loose finger 4 formation, climbing to 16,000 feet. Below them, the green jungle and blue waters of Iron Bottom Sound stretched into the distance. At 10:28 hours, the Japanese formation appeared on the northern horizon like a swarm of insects. Foss keyed his radio. Tally-ho, enemy bombers, 11 o'clock high. Escorts above and forward. This was the critical moment. The bombers' targets were Henderson Field's fuel dumps and the newly arrived B-17s on the runway. If they got through, the American air capability would be crippled for days. Standard doctrine called for attacking the escorts first, clearing the fighters before engaging the bombers. But that meant letting the bombers reach their targets. Foss made his decision in seconds. He would go straight through the Zero screen, head on. He banked hard left, pointing his Wildcat's nose directly at the lead bomber formation. His 3 wingmen followed. Closing speed, 550 miles per hour. The range clicked down impossibly fast, 1,500 yards, 1,200, 900. The Zero escorts reacted, breaking formation to intercept. Too late. Foss was already committed. At 600 yards, he pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber Brownings erupted, each gun firing 800 rounds per minute. The weapon's combined firepower, 90 pounds of lead per second, reached out like a horizontal lightning strike. The lead Betty's plexiglass nose shattered. The bombardier died instantly. Rounds punched through the bomber's unarmored fuselage, detonating fuel lines. At 400 yards, orange flames erupted from the Betty's port wing root. At 200 yards, Foss yanked back on the stick, pulling 5 Gs. The Wildcat climbed sharply, passing barely 50 feet over the burning bomber. His wingman, Lieutenant William P. Marentate, duplicated the attack on the second bomber. Another kill. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. Bombers broke formation. Zeros scattered, trying to engage the attackers who had already blown through their protective screen. But Foss wasn't finished. He rolled inverted at the top of his climb, pulled through, and dove back toward the confused enemy aircraft. At 14,000 feet, he spotted a Zero attempting to reform the escorts. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. Foss lined up the shot. 3-second burst. The Zero's engine cowling dissolved in a spray of metal fragments. White smoke poured from the Sakai radial engine. The fighter nosed over, trailing fire. The entire engagement had lasted 7 minutes. 2 bombers destroyed, 1 fighter confirmed. The remaining Japanese aircraft aborted their attack and fled northward. Henderson Field's bombers were untouched. But October 25th wasn't over. At 1330 hours, barely 3 hours after the first scramble, radar detected another massive strike inbound. This time, 15 Zeros and 9 bombers. The warning time was shorter. 12 Wildcats managed to get airborne, Foss leading his division again. The Japanese had learned from the morning's disaster. The Zero escorts flew tight around the bombers, creating an overlapping defensive web. Any frontal attack would mean flying through multiple streams of 20mm cannon fire. Foss assessed the situation at 12,000 feet. The bomber formation looked impenetrable. His fuel was already down to half tanks from the morning sortie. He attacked anyway. The lead Zero pilot saw Foss's Wildcat coming head-on and held his course, firing long bursts from his 2 20mm cannons. Foss felt the Wildcat shudder as 20mm rounds punched through his port wing, fabric shredded. The left aileron control went mushy. He kept the trigger pressed. At 300 yards, his tracer rounds converged on the Zero's engine. The Japanese fighter's propeller disintegrated. The pilot pulled up sharply, directly into Foss's flight path. For one frozen instant, collision seemed inevitable. Then the Zero's wingman, trying to follow his leader's violent maneuver, clipped his leader's tail with his propeller. Both fighters tumbled from the sky in a deadly embrace. 2 kills with 1 burst. Foss pulled out of the attack at 8,000 feet, his Wildcat trailing hydraulic fluid. The damaged aileron made the aircraft unstable. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. He had maybe 10 minutes of flying time left. Ahead of him, another Zero appeared, chasing a Wildcat in a steep dive. Foss pushed his damaged fighter into a pursuit angle. His closing speed was excessive, approaching 450 miles per hour. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, never checked his 6 o'clock. Foss opened fire at 200 yards. His rounds stitched up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Japanese fighter rolled inverted and spiraled into the jungle, his 5th kill of the day. He nursed the crippled Wildcat back to Henderson, touching down with barely 30 gallons of fuel remaining. The ground crew counted 37 bullet holes in the airframe. In 12 hours of operations on October 25th, 1942, Joe Foss had personally destroyed 5 Japanese aircraft and damaged 3 others. It was the single highest daily tally for any American fighter pilot up to that point in the war. The Marines' first ace in a day, and he had done it using the same reckless head-on tactics that his critics said would get him killed. The combat after-action reports from October 25th reached higher headquarters within 48 hours. Marine Aircraft Group 23's intelligence officers documented every detail of Foss's tactics: the frontal attacks, the closure rates, the deflection angles. Most critically, they analyzed the results: 5 confirmed kills, 0 friendly losses. What emerged was a revelation that contradicted 2 decades of fighter doctrine. The F-4F Wildcat, despite its performance disadvantages against the Zero, possessed 3 characteristics that made head-on attacks not just viable, but devastatingly effective. First, Structural superiority. The Wildcat's airframe could withstand battle damage that would destroy a Zero. Armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged construction meant Wildcats regularly returned to Henderson with dozens of bullet holes. Zeros, designed for maximum performance at minimum weight, had no armor protection. A single well-placed burst could catastrophically damage the lightweight fighter. Second, firepower advantage. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns delivered overwhelming frontal firepower. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute, generating a combined output of 4,800 rounds per minute. The Zero carried only two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons in its wings. Powerful, but requiring precise aim. In a 3-second head-on engagement where both pilots were pulling high G-forces, the Wildcat's volume of fire dramatically increased hit probability. Third, psychological impact. Major Duke Davis noted in his November 1942 operations report, enemy pilots invariably break away from head-on passes with Wildcats. Their aircraft cannot sustain damage. They know this. It affects their willingness to press attacks. Intelligence officers at Henderson interviewed captured Japanese pilots. One Zero pilot, shot down on November 2nd, described the new American tactics as terrifying. He explained that Japanese pilots expected American fighters to dive away or attempt tail chases. Head-on attacks violated those assumptions, forcing split-second decisions. When the Grumman comes straight at you, he said through interpreters, you must break or die. But breaking means losing the attack. You cannot win. The analysis spread rapidly through Marine Corps aviation channels. By mid-November, tactical bulletins from Guadalcanal were being circulated to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific. The key findings: head-on attacks achieved 3.2 times more kills per engagement than stern approaches against Zero fighters. Wildcat structural advantages negate the apparent suicide risk of frontal attacks. Bomber formations become defenseless when escorts are forced to break away from head-on passes. Enemy morale impact. Japanese pilots increasingly reluctant to press attacks when facing aggressive frontal defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, one of the Marine Corps' most experienced combat leaders, studied Foss's methods and incorporated them into squadron training. His assessment, written days before his own death in combat on November 14th, became required reading. Captain Foss has demonstrated that the Wildcat's combat weaknesses can be transformed into tactical advantages through aggressive employment. His tactics should become standard doctrine. The implications extended beyond the Solomons. Naval aviators adopted similar approaches aboard carriers. The Flying Tigers in China began experimenting with frontal attacks in their P-40 Warhawks. Even Army Air Force's squadrons in New Guinea incorporated the lessons learned at Henderson Field. But perhaps the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. In December 1942, U.S. naval intelligence intercepted Japanese radio traffic from Rabaul. The message, translated at Pearl Harbor, was addressed to all fighter units in the South Pacific. It read, "American pilots now attacking from frontal aspect with great aggression. Previous tactical assessments no longer valid. Exercise extreme caution." The enemy had adapted, but by then, Joe Foss had already rewritten the rules. On January 15, 1943, Joe Foss shot down his 26th enemy aircraft, matching the World War I record held by America's legendary ace, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. In just 98 days of combat operations, flying 42 combat missions, Foss had become America's first ace of aces in World War II. His final tally included 26 confirmed kills and 16 probables. On 5 separate occasions, he scored multiple victories in a single day. He was shot down twice, force-landed with battle damage 4 times, and survived countless close calls. President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented him with the Medal of Honor on May 18, 1943. The citation specifically noted his aggressive leadership and resolute fighting spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Though it didn't explicitly mention head-on tactics, every pilot who read the citation understood what it meant. The official tally showed VMF 121, Foss's squadron, recorded 164 confirmed aerial victories during the Guadalcanal campaign while losing 20 pilots. The squadron's kill ratio of 8.2.1 was the highest of any Marine fighter unit in the Solomons. 7 pilots from VMF 121 became aces. All had adopted Foss's frontal attack doctrine. The tactical innovations pioneered at Henderson Field transformed Pacific air combat. By early 1943, head-on attacks had become standard procedure for both U.S. Marine and Navy fighter squadrons. Training programs at Pensacola and Corpus Christi were rewritten to include frontal gunnery techniques. New pilots arrived in combat theaters already proficient in the tactics Foss had developed under fire. The ripple effects extended to aircraft design. When Grumman engineers began work on the F-6F Hellcat, the Wildcat's successor, they incorporated lessons from Guadalcanal. The Hellcat featured even more frontal armor, forward-firing armament concentrated in the wings for head-on effectiveness, and a structural design optimized for high-speed frontal attacks. The result was arguably the most successful carrier fighter of the war, with a kill ratio exceeding 19.1. Japanese aviation doctrine also evolved, though too late to change the war's trajectory. By mid-1943, 0 pilots received explicit instructions to avoid head-on engagements with American fighters. New aircraft designs like the Kawanishi N1K George incorporated armor protection and heavier armament specifically to counter frontal attacks. But Japan's industrial capacity couldn't match American production, and the tide had already turned. Foss himself returned to combat in 1944, commanding VMF 115 and flying F-4U Corsairs. The Pacific Air War had changed dramatically. American fighters outnumbered Japanese aircraft in most engagements. Experienced enemy pilots were increasingly rare. Foss flew dozens of additional missions, but recorded no further aerial victories. Not because his skills had diminished, but because by 1944 there were few targets left. After the war, he served as South Dakota's governor, the American Football League's first commissioner, and president of the National Rifle Association. He died on January 1, 2003, at age 87. In his 1943 autobiography, Foss wrote simply about his tactics. "I figured the Zero couldn't take punishment. The Wildcat could, so I made them shoot at me head on. Turns out I was right." Innovation in warfare rarely comes from headquarters staff or tactical manuals. It comes from warriors under pressure who refuse to accept that the rules cannot be changed. Joe Foss looked at the same aircraft, faced the same enemy, and flew in the same skies as hundreds of other fighter pilots in the Solomons. But he saw something different. He recognized that technical specifications on paper meant nothing compared to human factors. Courage, aggression, and willingness to close with the enemy even when conventional wisdom screamed to break away. The reckless, head-on attacks that his critics dismissed as cowboy tactics became the foundation of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. What appeared to be suicide became survival. What looked like recklessness was actually mathematical calculation combined with unflinching aggression. The lesson transcends aviation history. Sometimes the safest course is the one that looks most dangerous. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the old rules need to be broken by people brave enough or stubborn enough to ignore them. 80 years later, fighter pilots still study Joe Foss's tactics at Pensacola and Miramar. The specific aircraft have changed. The weapons have evolved. But the fundamental truth remains. When the enemy expects you to back down, the most devastating thing you can do is point your nose at him and press the attack. That's not recklessness. That's victory. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.